if you're on a pension or you don't have a high income, you can't get a house. So
that's because housing is privatised, though. If it was nationalised, if it was publicly run, you wouldn't have had the 12-year wait because of the private market just,
like
gobbling
in the
up all the
Soviet
houses.
Union, where there was no homeless people and you could get into a house straight away in the beautiful Soviet
I'm not a
Union.
Stalinist, so I'm not
so
advocating
what are
for
you
the
proposing?
Soviet
The government
Union.
take over all the properties? Like, I'm very confused.
Capitalism is the most common economic system in the world, but the divide between rich and poor in Australia is still growing. Is Australia's current version of capitalism still working, or has it outlived its purpose? Today, our panel is going to debate a range of statements based on common pressure points and online discussions. And just a reminder, the views shared here are not those of SBS. Workers are worse off under Australia's current version of capitalism. We're going to start with Jordan.
Definitely, workers are worse off. We live in one of the richest countries in the whole world. We have enough wealth, enough resources to provide for everyone to live a decent, happy life. But at the moment, instead, what we have is 1 in 3 households experienced food insecurity in 2025. 1 in 7 live in poverty. And, we're currently living through a housing crisis, a cost of living crisis, and environmental collapse. It sucks for workers in this country, but also at the same time, it doesn't suck for everyone. Some people are doing really fucking well. Gina Rinehart's wealth, for example, is 100,000 times the average Australian. She doesn't work 100,000 times harder than the average Australian. The richest 10% own 2/3 of all investment properties in this country. Some people are doing great, and the working class is not. If that were the case, then the wealthiest individuals in this country would be the nurses, the teachers, the firefighters, the cleaners, the ones that actually work really hard.
Does anyone want to respond to that?
I completely agree. It feels like we have this kind of K graph of wealth, where the wealth keeps going like this, and everyone else, they're either getting worse off or they're not getting any better. I used to be a huge believer that capitalism was the best solution, the right solution, and to some degree I think capitalism has its place. It works for the very wealthy, somewhat works for the middle class, and it doesn't work for our most poorest. And I think that's where socialism comes in, that's where government support comes in. We need more of that, but I just don't know how we get there.
It's just impossible to have this conversation without talking about how we treat housing. And so our living standards have materially gotten worse. All of our living standards have gotten worse because our income as a share of the value of housing has just been deflating. And that is why there is so much anger and resentment and debate, good debate that's happening, because people really feel like they are stuck. They can't make ends meet, and they're trying to hack the system by staying in a granny flat or staying at home into your 30s. I don't know anything about that. And so I just think the idea that work is what gets us ahead in life and is the thing that we value in Australia is just a complete lie. We do not value hard work. We do not value work. If we did, we would celebrate work, and that would be changing the tax system and changing the housing system.
Eddie, you're a business owner. What are your thoughts?
Just from my personal experience, I've seen over the last 10, 15 years that in terms of working conditions, I've seen it improve, and I've seen it for my team members now. I have 70 employees. I don't even remember HR being a thing back when I first got a job. So they can talk to, therapist or whatever they need if they're on stress leave or whatever it is. Have wages kept up? Compared to house prices, absolutely not. I'll agree with you with that. But I have seen personally wages myself go up dramatically over the past 5 to 10 years.
That's not correct. Real wages have declined to a 2011 level at the moment.
It's not in my business.
Real wages have gone down.
I can only speak for myself.
Yeah, but real wages have gone down because of inflation and things, but there's also all the non-wage costs of employment. You add superannuation on top of that, you add, if people get leave entitlements, you have to have an accounting team to pay them, all these other non-wage costs of employment have grown as well, and that's a product of regulation. And not saying it's a bad thing, it's something that we've chosen that we want people to have better conditions. So that's probably where there's the disconnect between a business owner and a worker.
But that's not the complete.
I'm not saying it's a complete
Real wages
thing.
have just declined.
No, I agree with you. Real wages have declined, but there's that.
And they haven't been caught
past each
up
other.
by, the 1% increase in superannuation.
Yeah, no.
Contributions. That's just
no,
not.
but it's not just about super. There's like
all
lots
the
of
other
things.
But that doesn't meet the gap that's been created.
100%.
Real wages have
100%.
gone
I agree with you.
backwards.
But this is, and I think this is getting back to like what I don't think workers are well off under this version of, I wouldn't even call what we have now capitalism. It's like big government, big corporate, like a terrible system. Half of the jobs created in the decade after the GFC were in healthcare and social assistance, education and training, and public administration. Now, those three industries are characterised by high rates of part-time work and low wages. So we were told this transition to a services-based economy was going to be great. Really, it's just these taxpayer-funded, low-wage, part-time jobs, which
That
suck.
subsidise private companies, yeah.
I definitely see that it's a lot harder for workers and especially young people. But I feel like there's also a lot of opportunities as well for our generation. Like if you actually have a look at some of the richest Australians, like some of them are actually young people that have started innovative businesses that are changing the world. And I feel like maybe if we found ways to like support people into maybe creating their own businesses, it would just be more prosperous for all of us. One of my friends, he started a business from Western Sydney as well and turned into like $100 million business. And he actually moved overseas and like took that business overseas because he didn't really see the growth opportunity in Australia. And it's just such a shame that, some of these really innovative companies and business owners like moving overseas, taking all those jobs and resources with them.
I think like with that example that you use is really good because like when you say, this person took their business away to another country and started doing it there, like we don't need that person. At the end of the day, like it's working people that make the whole world run like they do for every single business. Workers know how to run businesses better than their bosses. Like the Sydney Opera House was completed under workers' control, for example. They kicked the bosses off the site and then finished it themselves. We don't need bosses. We don't need people like hoarding their capital and then threatening people to move, or threatening governments to move their capital overseas if they implement some policy that they don't like. They should just disappear and workers should run everything because we make everything run.
The problem with and I agree, having workers owning the businesses they work for would be a good thing, and that I firmly believe in profit sharing schemes and like employee ownership, share ownership and things like that. It's great. The problem becomes one of coordination, and that's the beauty of capitalism, is you have someone who comes along and they have money and they say, I'm going to start a business. It's hard to do that if you've got 1,000 random people. So that's the beauty of capitalism as a system, is this coordination and it's the profit motive, is that incentive to coordinate something complex, most of the time put something on the line. And it was interesting you talking about this distinction between business owner and workers. Like that's what self-employment is. Like that's if you're an electrician.
Yeah, I'm not talking about like the petty bourgeois or anything. I'm talking about like workers and the people who exploit their labour.
Yeah, exploit is such a loaded term though.
Yeah, but, correct.
Well, it's not exploitation if you go and voluntarily work for someone.
Yeah, if you have to survive, yes, it is.
Well, everyone has to work. Like you have to earn a living.
Because we need to survive.
So then you're being exploited.
100%.
Yeah,
So
that's exploitation. That's the definition of exploitation.
I'm-
You have to do
That's
something.
how the world is. You've got to
you
work
have
to make
to-
money.
Totally, yeah, and that's therefore why it's exploitation.
You have to eat and you have to like warm yourself or shelter yourself.
Correct.
And so I guess in days gone by, people used to try to do that on their tiny little scale of
when we lived in a feudal
toiling
society.
in a field. Yeah, well, before that even, toiling in a field. You have to work to live. That's like...
Totally,
that's just a fact
but you
of
don't have to be
life,
exploited to live. So like that, in a feudal society, for example, people owned their own means of production. It wasn't great, it wasn't a great way to live, but there wasn't like a boss or a factory
Hang on.
worker
In a
exploiting.
feudal system where you literally had a lord and you had a serf, I think there was
Yeah, but you were given board and
Not for
food.
everyone.
You didn't pay for
You
food.
owned the things that you needed.
Love board and food.
I don't want to go back to feudalism. No,
Feudal society, that's,
we're on
like, very
track.
interesting.
We're on track to feudalism.
I
I would say
100% agree
because
with you.
right now, as you're explaining, like we have to work to be able to feed ourselves, to be housed. So we're working for the capital owners that have the profit motive. Where did they get that capital from? It was still from workers. So while I agree, like you do need to have someone that can be like a ringleader, but that you can do that within a worker-centric like view where you still
decide
don't
that
have a hierarchy,
democratically.
right? So you don't need someone to have accumulated wealth based on the work of others to then come and then accumulate more wealth based on the work of others. And the profit motive inherently gets in the way of actually those workers' quality of life, because the profit motive doesn't serve the product or the workers, it only serves the people that are profiting.
This is, sorry, I'm just going to make this point really quickly.
Please.
This is the absolutely amazing, beautiful, revolutionary thing about living in a free capitalist society. You can go do that if you want to.
No,
you
we
can go
can't-
start a
we
workers'
can't,
collective.
because-
Yes, you can. You can go. No one is stopping you from starting a workers' collective and going and doing that.
Capital
You're
is
totally
capital
welcome.
is.
Yeah, but we don't have access to workers.
You go and get a loan and you start a business. That's how it works.
And then you have
You
to,
can't just go and get a
you're
loan.
beholden
Like, there's so many
to
things. You have to have a
fucking bank.
property to get a loan potentially.
I
Like,
agree,
there's lots
so
of
we
ways.
should-
I grew up poorer than anyone here, I would dare say.
How do you know that?
because I know. Mount Druitt, Western Sydney, I'm very confident in that. So I think it's up to the individual. Like, yes, you can't just say it's too hard, it's too difficult, and there shouldn't be a boss out there. Why? I think, some bosses give people a bad rap, but like, you need people to be rewarded for the risk that they take. Otherwise, businesses wouldn't be started in the first place.
Australia is the land of the fair go. If you work hard enough, you can overcome anything.
I think it's complete bullshit. We supposedly cultivate this idea that hard yakka is the most important thing in Australia, and if you just get into the pits and pull your socks up, that you can achieve anything. But we have a system that punishes us for doing that work and rewards just sitting on property or sitting on an investment that appreciates over time. If you win a marathon, but you got a head start halfway down the running track, then you didn't really win based on merit. And that's the truth of privilege in a society like Australia. That there's people that are born in super high socioeconomic areas that have way more opportunity, way more chance, way more capital to invest, and opportunities from their network, from the schools they went to, and there are people that are born into the opposite end of the spectrum.
From my personal experience, like, I grew up in housing commission, in poverty. My mother's only source of income was a pension. Now, personally owning a lot of property and a business and well off, I'd say I'm the exception, but I think it's a combination of, you have to learn to take the accountability on yourself at the same time, because I've found personally over the years, if I would say it's this person's fault or it's the government's fault, or then I would be giving them the power in a sense. There's a lot of things that could be changed and improved upon that. Like, I would rather try to empower someone than say it's too difficult.
Do you think that everyone can achieve what you've achieved? If everyone, how many homes do you own?
I own different types of properties, like over 180 properties that I personally own. Do I think that people can get to my level? Everybody? Obviously not, because then everyone would have that. I realised from a young age when I was a teenager that people that were well off, they owned property or they had a good job, and I was not around that atmosphere at all. So my goal was to get a property as soon as I could. I couldn't even qualify to buy a property to live in because my weekly wage was like $500 per week. The only other option was to buy a small investment property, and then I used that to buy more, and I continued saving and living humbly at the same time.
What would you say to someone sleeping rough? Like, how would they get their foot in the door?
Like, pretty much the same way I did. I took it upon myself to learn, and nowadays I believe it's actually probably even easier to get the right information and knowledge if they've got YouTube. Like, all that stuff is for free. Like, that wasn't around when I was starting out. But
So
I guess
you
it's a
reckon
combination.
someone sleeping rough can buy like a cheaper property, like now, because of YouTube?
Oh, define sleeping rough.
Like sleeping on the street?
Well, that's a different thing, I would say. Like, they obviously have to get a job and work and get an income, I think, no matter what, if they want to buy a house or not. Like, I think that's probably somewhere to start.
I want to go back to meritocracy. I feel like a lot of people that grow up with families from immigrant backgrounds, you kind of get taught, like, if you just work hard, go to school, get a good job, like, you're sorted for life. And it wasn't until over time where I realized that necessarily isn't the case. And there was a study done, and they looked at 260,000 people's tax returns, and they were really surprised because they found that if you went to the same university and did the same degree, the children that had wealthier parents ended up earning more. And that's not to say like it is only caused by having wealthy families, but it just goes to show, yes, personal responsibility helps, but it's also acknowledging the hurdles.
Totally, yeah.
I would agree with that, for sure.
Yeah, like we know that like the biggest determinators of how successful you are or how much wealth you get are, which postcode were you born in? How many houses do your parents own? How much do your parents earn? Like, were you born with a disability? Are you Aboriginal or a Torres Strait Islander, for example? These things we have no control over, and they're the biggest determinants of how well we do. Like, I think it's absolutely ridiculous to assume that if anyone works hard, you know, they can achieve whatever they want.
But Australia didn't used to be like that. Obviously, disadvantages always existed and certain people have had it rougher than others. To, you know, our parents or grandparents, it was the case that if you went and got a job and worked hard and saved money, you could buy a house. It's not the case anymore, for young people in particular. So among 25 to 34-year-olds, in 1981, the bottom 20% of income earners in that age group owned a house, 45%. So almost half owned a house. In 2021, it's 25%. So what we've seen across all age groups is lower income households are no longer homeowners, whereas they used to be. That's like the foundation for then building, you know, broader wealth or building some kind of intergenerational wealth. So I don't think we really are, particularly for younger Australians, not really the country of a fair go anymore.
We hear this catchphrase, billionaires shouldn't exist. No one should be worth billions of dollars. And we'll start with Sim.
When someone says like billionaires shouldn't exist, you kind of hear of the idea of the shrinking middle class, and billionaires are such a on-the-nose visual representation of how much wealth exists. And so I understand the frustration. Are billionaires even good for society, or should we get rid of them? Because if they're not useful, like, they shouldn't be here. If they can add value, exactly what value do they add? I don't necessarily have a problem with someone having $1 billion. My issue with them is when they use that money to start getting involved in policy and government. We should all have one vote.
There's no billionaire that has no political sway, that just doesn't have anything to do with politics. Most billionaires, as we move forward, will be inherited billionaires. And so that comes with an inherent political sway. The other side of the billionaires, like you can talk about, like most billionaires in Australia, some of them like are self-made, they like began a business or whatever, but like there's no such thing as self-made billionaires. It's based on the workers that created the value of that business. They also exist on government loans, government investment, like tax concessions. Like there is no billionaire that exists outside of the political systems. I don't think that like there's a moral argument for a billionaire to exist, because it means that they have accumulated so much wealth based on the surplus value of the people that worked in their businesses or our taxpayers' money. Elon Musk is a perfect example in America. Like most of his wealth comes from American taxpayers.
I completely agree. We don't need billionaires. I don't believe like in the trickle-down economy, and I agree they are in policy and they're in government and they're creating that. I want them out of that. That's where I stand.
So it's like, unless you stop billionaires existing, they will not be out of that. Either way, it's still political sway, and I have a way more power than the average voter to do that, purely just based on my existence.
That's
so
right.
when we say people, like billionaires shouldn't exist, I think people would be like, let's get the guillotines out. But really, it's just about like creating the settings within the policy framework to not allow so much wealth accumulation to happen in the first place. Because wealth begets wealth. The more money you have, the more money you have to invest, the more money you make, and you can start buying elections, and capitalism turns into an oligarchy, which is something that we are really seeing. We have like 51 billionaires. They make $67,000 an hour each on average, which is very close to the median wage in Australia. And that will continue to increase unless we change something, because like, why wouldn't it?
Look, I personally don't mind if billionaires exist or not, but what I find interesting is that if we were to rewind the clock back, there would probably be a group of people like 100 or 200 years ago saying that millionaires shouldn't exist either. But I'd say the billionaire is the new millionaire from, 100 or 200 years ago.
That's inflation.
But they're not. But they're not, because like the level of wealth, the level of wealth, humans have never existed in a time where there have been a class of people that have so much.
Such
wealth.
concentrated.
Like we've never kings, queens.
Well, we
like,
did.
Emperors. No, we never have.
We did.
It's just that we never have. Like, yes, there's been a huge wealth inequality, but it's never been as great as it is today. That is just a fact. Fact check me.
Yeah, I think it is a bit scary, because when you think about wealth and the compounding that happens, like once you have investments, and it's just like an infinite money loop, and you can assume that the billionaires that exist today will be billionaires forever and their families will. But there are some actually interesting studies. It's called the third generation curse, that wealth only really lasts 3 generations. Obviously, it's not the case for every single family, but the first generation makes all the money. They grew up in tough times, they hustled. Second generation, they're taught to preserve the wealth. And the third generation, they've just never known struggle at all. So they just spend all the money, and then the cycle happens again. Obviously, we want to make sure that, you don't have these people that just keep on printing money forever, but it's kind of it is interesting.
You can also stop that wealth with inheritance tax. I mean, America surprisingly does a decent job at it. They have inheritance tax, and I really don't see why that doesn't exist in other countries. You didn't used to be for it. I was like, no, if I work hard and I accumulate money and I give it to my kid, like, why does that get taxed again? But then I understood, like, after a certain amount of money, if you are receiving $500 million, you're not going to work. So then those people become not useless members of society, but useless in the sense of adding to the tax revenue.
But if you just tax them, like, I'm assuming you don't want to cut their heads off, you want to tax them out of existence.
Not at this point. I'd like to tax them out of existence.
But,
I think that's a better
won't they
option.
just move? Like, won't they just go somewhere else?
But what are they taking with them?
Well, they have all that money, right?
Yeah.
I do.
But where are they going to? What are they putting it into?
I do.
Well,
And then the employees would be out of work.
They can go to, like, many other countries in the world.
Yeah,
People say,
Yeah.
you can come here and pay taxes here on the proviso that you make an investment here or whatever it is.
Which is
And
why
so
it's not good enough to just tax them. We need to expropriate the wealth.
You could
So
do an exit
you want
tax.
to actually just
Yes.
take
yes.
everything off.
Totally, yeah. Like we know, like, billionaires are profoundly useless.
They're not profoundly useless.
They're profoundly
This is
useless.
insane
I
to
think
talk
the
about another
idea
human
that,
being
like,
like this.
60% of all billionaire wealth is either inherited, comes from cronyism, or monopolies.
60% of billionaires.
60% of all billionaire wealth, you can fact check that as well. I'll send you the link if you want. They only exist because, again, of the exploitation of the labour of others, or they just were born into the right family, or they just have the right political connections, or they just own a monopoly. If we take Elon Musk, for example, what the fuck does he do? He does nothing. It's the, like, child slaves working in the lithium mines that are doing all of the productive capacity building to make the lithium that goes into his fucking batteries. He doesn't do that. He just has money, and we should take that money.
We agree we should take it. That's the whole tax thing. And exit tax is actually a really good point. In India, there's a 20% exit tax. You take $1 out, you pay 20 cents on it. People will then not take the $1 out, or they commit fraud and take it the other way. To answer the question about what if billionaires leave, that's what multinationals usually do to scare countries. They go, okay, well, I started Canva here, and Canva is growing, and if you want to tax me, I'll just move it to Ireland. That's where, you know, everyone goes to. I don't think we can get rid of them, so let's make them work for the everyday person.
If you're trying to defend the existence of billionaires, to on one hand say that they have, like, this net benefit for society, and then also be like, but if we tax them, they're going to pick up their balls and go home like a spoiled little brat. If they are going to go to the Bahamas or to Ireland or whatever to get favourable tax concessions, like, we should think of them very poorly. Like, we should think, like, that's a shit go. Like, you're taking capital that accumulated by the workers of Australia, and you're going to be like, well, now you're going to tax me and I can't buy my 17th yacht. Like, that's not the Australian way. Like, that's not where I think that most of us agree on the value of, like, we should care about each other and work hard for the sake of all of society.
I don't think Australians really think about billionaires. I think they think about themselves and their families and how things are going for them. Things are not going great for ordinary working class Australians, but it's this real, like, undergraduate politics of envy to think that because someone has made a lot of money and accumulated capital, oftentimes it's a business or, you know, a factory or whatever it is, or natural resources that they have custodianship over, basically. They've created all this wealth, created all these jobs, created all this tax revenue, and contributed enormously to the economy. I don't think most Australians actually sit there thinking about it all the day and being like, oh, I'm so envious of these people and our lives would be so much better if they didn't exist. They can exist and you can have a decent standard of living at the same time.
You've decided it's envy. You've described it as envy. It's not envy. It's I'm looking at this from a point of inequality and unfairness. Australia, the land of the fair go, I'm looking at the fact that they've accumulated this wealth. Gina Rinehart, for example, inherited her wealth. That was
She did not inherit her wealth.
Yes, she had a rich father.
She didn't inherit the amount of money that she's worth now. She didn't inherit that.
And then also,
Yeah, she doubled it in 1 year, but she didn't. She didn't work.
based on commodity prices and things. Like,
Yeah,
her
Totally,
wealth goes
yeah.
up and
Not
her wealth
her
goes
own
down.
hard work.
She didn't like innovate something, like created a product that, like, existed in the earth for billions of years and come up with something cool and new, and ultimately is damaging the planet.
It's a huge coordination problem. I think you're massively understating and
The hard work of Gina Rinehart.
about the people like that who managed to coordinate. Iron ore exports were banned in Australia, and it was like Lang Hancock, her father, who campaigned to be able to export iron ore. I don't think you can understate what a massive achievement that is to unlock that wealth for Australians to export their natural resources.
But like most of that wealth has not stayed in Australia.
For some Australians, like
that company in particular, Hancock Prospecting, is headquartered in Australia and has paid taxes in Australia,
but not,
has invested in multiple projects, has created tens of thousands of jobs, has paid out insane bonuses to all of their workers, including all the workers up on site. Like, I just don't think you're very well informed about
wealth
that.
that they, like, as a proportion, like those workers, those particular workers that work for Hancock, generate way more like money for Hancock Prospecting than
shareholders.
Yeah, than like any other worker in this country. But they get paid as a proportion of the wealth that they generate. They actually get paid very little compared to other workers. They should get paid a lot more than the amount that they're already paid, which is a fair bit.
But do you know what they're paid? Do you know what a truck driver?
It depends.
They get paid a lot of money for sure, but again, it's the proportionality of the wealth that they generate. And the point is, there were natural resources that there is no reason in an alternative version of Australia we could have nationalised those resources. We could have a sovereign wealth fund like somewhere like Norway, and we would be living a way higher quality of life.
I don't think we should demonise billionaires in a sense, because again, like 100 years ago, there wasn't millionaires around in Australia. At this rate, with the amount of properties that I own and my total worth, like I'll be a billionaire by the time I'm 40 in another 6-7 years.
We should be nice to billionaires. I might be one.
So no, it's not. It's
I'm kidding.
like we shouldn't demonise. Like there's
I don't
billionaires
think you
out
should
there.
demonise any human being.
Yeah,
personally.
that too.
Hitler.
But there's things as like you were referring to Canva before. Like
Yes.
sorry, they became a billionaire, right? So I don't think we should demonise billionaires in that regard, because they are very innovative in one sense. Are there bad ones? Yes. Are there good ones? Yes.
Housing shouldn't be treated as an investment. Eddie, can we start with you?
The environment that I grew up in poverty and housing commission, in arguably one of Sydney's worst suburbs, a lot of people didn't have jobs. You can't qualify for a loan when you are on Centrelink. I'm probably arguably the only one here that actually grew up in housing commission. It was actually over a 12-year wait to get a house in public housing. So prior to that, where would we have lived if property investors did not then rent properties out to us? If you did change the rules to eliminate property investors, you'd have millions of people homeless. Personally owning over 180 properties, I personally would encourage people to take accountability for their own and learn on how they can get ahead. And while housing should be available for everybody, yes, but it's not meant to be easy.
I personally don't think that there's something wrong with investing in properties. Like I personally do have an investment property, but I do feel like it starts to become an issue, especially when we do have really, really expensive housing prices. I mean, Sydney's now like the second most unaffordable housing market in the world, just after Hong Kong. It's interesting because Singapore, I feel like, is one of those places that should be in the top 10, yet the government has put in measures to make sure that housing is affordable. So for example, about 80% of the population of Singapore, they actually live in government housing, but it's not government housing like we know it here. People are able to buy into it and they have a 99-year lease and they're able to like sell it. And they also do have extra taxes on people who do invest in more than one property, which we don't really have anything like that here.
Jordan, can I get your perspective on investing in property?
Yeah, I reckon investing in property is morally reprehensible. I don't think anyone should be profiting off something that someone else needs to survive. And I think if we're trying to compare situations, like imagine if there was a famine and people on the street were dying from starvation and you had 150 warehouses full of food and you were just hoarding that to make a little bit more money. I think you would understand probably if people on the street suffering from starvation or homelessness turned on you.
Do you think people will turn on property investors?
Yeah.
Housing is doubling every 10 years. It can't keep doing that. It's exponential growth. So it's exponential growth for you to continue buying properties while the rest of us are exponentially getting further and further away from being able to buy our first home. I'm assuming in your 150 properties that you have, every one of those was a brand new dwelling or a brand new office. You bought existing properties that someone else could have owned their first one. So it's not fair. I don't think this idea that we have three classes. We have renters, we have owner-occupiers, and we have landlords or property investors.
What
right?
about the Centrelink people that can't afford a property? Like, where do they live if you
But
get
the only reason
investors?
that property is expensive is because people speculate on property. We could just say today, like somehow we could just wipe all the value of housing off. The houses would still be there.
Yeah.
The house could be worth $1 each, and those people could walk into a house tomorrow. It's an artificial
Inflation
value.
would never let housing be $1 each. That inflation just continues going up.
You won't let it. I'm happy for housing. I'm happy for it to be $1.
There's millions of properties out there. Inflation will
Exactly. There's
continue
millions of
going up.
properties out there, so the
Stop
people that live on
existing.
Centrelink could buy a house that was affordable.
You can't get a
relative
loan
there.
if you're on Centrelink.
Again, this is the housing market
Because I grew up on Centrelink.
The housing market that where we exist in doesn't allow you to get a loan
That's
on
the
Centrelink
banking system.
because
Not the banking system doesn't allow you to
and
do
the,
that.
yeah, and the two main architects of the housing crisis are property investors and the banks. The banks are the evil
the
that sits
banks is the one
above,
thing.
but like they're the ones that make the most profit. And why would they invest in business when they can just loan you the money for a house that they know is going to double in 10 years, and if you default on that loan, then they can sell the house in an endlessly inflating market. The only reason why people are investing in property is because we've culturally agreed that that's the way that we build our wealth. But we've just made that up. There's the cost of building, the bricks and mortar, the cost of the labor and the cost of the products. That's the cost of a house. But most of it is just made up value. We've just decided that houses in Sydney cost $5 million for a brick shit house. I don't blame you for getting into property because that is just the cultural obsession that we exist within. I think your money would be doing a lot better in other areas of the economy, and you would actually be better off, and the rest of us would be better off because there'd be more houses available for owner-occupiers, creating a downward pressure on house prices to make sure that people on Centrelink could also afford a house eventually.
I don't know the in-depth details about the different policies because I believe that a person's individual circumstances, that they should take that upon themselves to learn that, like, you shouldn't hate the player or the game. Like, you should just learn the game and then learn how to win it.
But that's why we call like the housing market a Ponzi scheme, because you rely on more people wanting to invest in property for your property to inflate in value, to make your capital gain from that property to buy more property. So
Properties go
so
up
what
no
you're
matter
saying
what.
is we have to all play a game that is unfair. And so that's the problem, and that policy can be changed from a government level. Anyway, I'll shut up.
When people say like, don't hate the player, hate the game, I do understand where you're coming from. And I think for clarification, I also own a plot of land. I've got 2 houses on them and I rent them out. I don't think property in itself is a bad thing. Also, property is naturally an investment because it becomes an asset class. It's the same as like, you know, a picture frame is just a picture frame, but if there's art in it and lots of people want that art, it suddenly goes up in value. And saying that...
You don't need the frame or the picture to survive, I guess.
That's true, that's true.
It's like supply and demand though, and they don't make any more land, so it's going to go up no matter what.
I do agree with what you're saying, and my perspective is Australia is so unique. We love our property, we see property as a safety net, and we've kind of overindulged into that. And that's worked for our parents' generation, our grandparents' generation, but doesn't work for us. And I remember what it was like being a first home buyer. It's so, you go home and you kind of cry every day. And saying that, I think people need to move their investments out of property and move them into other asset classes like shares, like startups. I invest in venture. We can't stop people from wanting to improve their wealth and their lives, but we can encourage them through policies like, hey, if you take your money out of property and put it here, and you get an incentive.
Higher return.
Or a high, well, the returns.
You do get a higher return. And you might be curing cancer or inventing the next thing that's going to change society by investing in businesses that innovate.
Exactly.
So I think I agree with Eddie that there is a role for investors to play. Like, at the end of the day, the system should be one where people can make a decision, but every Australian should be able to buy a house if that's what they want to do. I actually completely agree with you about the way it's like we've gamified the housing system, total Ponzi scheme, but you can't deny the role that immigration plays in that. Because if you look at the biggest property investors in Australia, they will say don't touch things like negative gearing, and they will say bring in more people.
We stopped immigration during COVID and house prices went up
Quicker than it's
they've ever gone.
Well, at first they went down.
They went up in the year. They went up. They went up the highest amount. Property
printed a
values
shitload of money.
increased
Yeah,
the
we did
most
have
that
that as
they'd
well.
ever increased when we had negative migration. I disagree wholeheartedly. The data does not support the fact that immigration is increasing house prices. It's the tax settings and our cultural obsession with property that increases house prices. If we stopped immigration tomorrow, house prices would continue to rise because you need house prices to continue to rise. Otherwise, you lose money.
Since the pandemic, we've brought in 1.3 million people in net overseas migration. You can't ramp up migration in the country and not be building houses and then expect house prices to stay in a range where people
But we
can
are
afford
building
them.
houses.
Yeah.
There's been more dwellings completed than there's been households formed. So that's just a racist scapegoat.
How's that a racist
for the
scapegoat?
last 4
It just
decades,
is.
we've built more houses than our population has grown in terms of percentage. So if we accept that in the 80s that housing was affordable for most people, even for on low incomes, we've built more houses than our population has needed. We've had influx of of immigration over the last 5 years, which isn't actually much higher than it would have been had the pandemic not happened. So the immigration argument is one that is potent because it's easy to blame immigrants for the housing crisis rather than the structural issues which were created by neoliberal economics.
I don't think that you can tell ordinary people watching at home that this immigration thing isn't a problem. It's a huge problem. Everyone watching...
Only if you say it is.
Yeah, it's easy to blame
is.
migration
These
than it
people
is
need
to
to live
blame people
somewhere.
like Eddie who
They need to
own
live somewhere.
180 homes.
They need to live somewhere.
Queenie, please.
From someone that comes from an immigrant background, it's not actually as easy as people think it is. You know, my dad came to Australia, he studied engineering, he worked for Sydney Water, he built like many of the clean drinking water systems that we all still use today. It's really difficult for immigrants to find work and to actually stay here. So the ones that are able to stay here, the reason they are doing that is because they contribute a lot to our economy. Yeah,
I don't think anyone will deny that immigrants contribute a lot, but people need to live somewhere.
Yeah, there's
that's how
houses
you
for
feel
them.
the
so
housing.
just
Of
give
course,
them-
yeah.
Privatising Australia's public services would make them more effective. Cian, do you want to start?
I don't think there really is an argument about economic efficiency. Like privatised government services have been better. And I think it's interesting to look at like an example of that in Australia with the national electricity market. It was privatised in the late 90s. And then it worked. We had affordable electricity. Then over the last kind of 15 years, 20 years, when the government started to get more involved again, and we've seen this kind of deprivatisation of the national electricity market, prices have gone up, reliability has gone down, and everyone's paying the cost. People sitting at home can feel that real example of the government getting back into the electricity grid and how poorly that's gone.
Yeah, I disagree.
We privatised the poles and wires in that time. We sold everything off. And the reason why energy bills are expensive is because we have private businesses selling our resources, our gas overseas, and selling it back to us at international rates. So the increase in our energy bills is purely due to the privatisation of our resources and the services. The thing that is actually putting downward pressure is government investment on renewables that have come into the grid.
Yeah,
so,
but we privatised it and then the government just jumped right back in. And so you can't say, well, it's a privatised grid when the government says what you can use to generate the electricity, how much percentage of your generation has to come from solar and wind. Like when the government is so involved in all those things, you can't. It's not really a privatised market.
But that's not the thing that makes it expensive. Like $12 for every $100 that we spend on our electricity bill actually goes to the cost of generating the power. The rest is pretty much purely like profit for a bunch of private companies that are like, you know, having their little profit-making, shenanigans. We've had this privatisation experiment in Australia for, you know, Qantas, electricity, health insurance, roads, ports, like anything that you can think of, we've privatised. None of those services have gotten better. They've all gotten worse and more expensive. And we still, you know, subsidise people. There is no need to profit from people's human needs. And that's the reason that everything is so expensive, because there's a profit motive. Like everything should just be nationalised.
I do agree somewhat with like some things we should never privatise. For example, healthcare. I feel like that is like a human right, and as soon as you turn that into a business, it just gets a little bit, it gets messy.
Yeah, like housing and stuff.
I do feel like though, sometimes the government might not be as efficient at spending our money as, say, like a business
But why?
might. I'm not sure why. Did you see the new BOM website, Bureau of Meteorology? It costs $100 million for a website.
Because they
for a
outsourced to a private company.
Yeah, I
which
mean, no
increased the cost.
business would spend that much money
Totally,
on a website.
we
So
should
it's
have that
like
in-house.
If it was in a free market, business to business, they're never going to spend that much money. But that's where you've got the worst combination of big government and big
private
government
government.
largesse, and then
But it's
big
not big
corporates.
government
No,
that's
but big
the problem.
corporates who say you
Totally,
beauty
yeah,
will
yeah.
go in. The government spending more and more money will go in and get some.
Yeah,
Like,
I'll
that's
take free
terrible.
money.
Yeah.
Totally, yeah.
Yeah,
If you're a private
terrible.
company, why wouldn't you take free money from the government, particularly this Labor government who is really keen on handing it out to whoever the fuck they want?
we need to be like more efficient at spending the money and just making sure that it's not wasted, because I feel like, yeah, we need that balance.
But there's
for
no
sure.
like people aren't born as like a public sector worker or a private sector worker, and then somehow these private sector workers like woke up, came out of the womb, and were like, I'm just more efficient at my job. Like that's not like the people that can work in both fields can transfer and do transfer. There's no reason why the private sector is inherently more efficient. Like the profit motive like really makes for a scenario which actually doesn't make it more efficient, it makes it more profitable.
But do you think that maybe the government is the best at attracting like the top talent of Australia to make sure that, you know, we are spending our money wisely and we are spending our like hard-earned tax dollars like in the best way possible?
Totally.
Yeah,
They would
that's
attract,
what I think.
Yeah, definitely.
We need to
I'm
attract
Totally.
the best of the best.
I'm a public servant. I've worked in the private sector. In the private sector, my role was to make as much money for this private company as possible. In the public sector, my job is to do my job to the best of my ability. Like the motive is completely different, and it, you know, results in worse outcomes for people, for customers, for everyday Australians, when your job is to make as much money as you can for some shareholder that you don't know, than to make sure that someone's needs are met.
And healthcare seems like a perfect example of that. Like a for-profit doctor isn't going to provide better service than a for-service doctor.
Not necessarily. The public sector doctor, you work an 8-hour day, 5 days a week, and that's it. Because if you choose to work an extra day, you're not going to capture any extra value. And then you have a private sector doctor who has a private practice, and you say, if you choose to be open 7 days a week, you can make more money. There's an incentive there for the doctor to be open and available to people 7 days a week. And that's the beauty of the private market, is it's about incentive.
You shouldn't have to have an incentive to make sure that people don't die, and particularly when the incentive is the profit motive. Like, I don't think that's right.
So there is absolutely a case for public ownership of a public hospital that's available to anyone, no matter what time of the day or night, how much money they have in their bank account, they can rock up and receive healthcare. Absolutely. But if you have an entirely public system where then you don't allow doctors to work extra hours and earn extra money.
Why can't you do that? Why can't you just have more doctors working for the public system, more GPs that aren't, you know, working for a boss that is a clinic that is profiting from
But what's
their
the problem
labour?
with having both?
Because the profit motive makes everything more expensive.
What's the problem with the profit motive? It doesn't make things.
You don't need the profit motive to have more doctors. You can just hire more doctors and pay them well.
I think people become doctors because it pays quite well.
Yeah, so we should pay doctors well.
It's the same as like teaching or something. Like we
should
can just afford to pay teachers more. Like
and
they can't work on a Saturday as a teacher. But like we should just be paying them a livable wage to that based on the value that they create to society. But when you think of that from a private schooling perspective, the ultimate goal there is to increase profit, increase school fees. But the reason why you're able to attract like better teachers in the private sector is only because we're underpaying public sector teachers or underpaying public sector nurses. So
it's not even that the teachers are better or worse. It's just like they have less resources because the government underfunds the public schools. Like the teachers are excellent in public schools.
My personal issue with privatisation is it just genuinely it creates so much inequity. If you're someone that has money, you can go get an x-ray. You have much better health outcomes if you go to a private school.
Totally.
You probably have much better education outcomes.
Because you can afford to, yeah.
It creates an issue that I have, which is if you privatise things more and more, then what you see in healthcare, in my past life, I was an optometrist, and you could see that patients that didn't get access to good healthcare, that went through the public system, they would not be able to get seen fast because the public system had so much stress. They would then have worse outcomes, and it would actually be a higher cost to the government because you have more poverty, more negative distribution. There's all these like offset effects of privatisation, which is probably hard to measure. I wouldn't want Australia to get more privatised.
Yeah,
I'd say, obviously, from a property investment perspective, you have to have the private sector there. There was over a 12-year wait for myself and my single mum who was on a pension on Centrelink. If you're on a pension or you don't have a high income, you can't get a house. So
that's because housing is privatised, though. If it was nationalised, if it was publicly run, you wouldn't have had the 12-year wait because you wouldn't have had to wait 12 years to have a a house because of the private market just,
like
gobbling
in the
up all the
Soviet
houses.
Union where there was no homeless people and you could get into a house straight away in the beautiful
Sure, I'm not a Stalinist, so I'm not
So
advocating
what are you
for the
proposing?
Soviet
The
Union.
government take over all the properties? Like I'm very
why not?
confused.
Well, they did
not?
that in
How would they do that?
They did that
I mean,
in
we can
Singapore and
expropriate it.
Vienna.
You can come up.
We
with
can do
good
that. An
ideas-
individual can do
ideas
that.
like that.
You can
but,
go
like,
squat
how
in all the
what's
empty
There
houses.
were two case studies.
way to do it?
I had the same thought process. I was like, oh, how on earth can you make housing public? It doesn't
Build public housing. It's pretty simple.
Well, it's simple, but it's also not, because you'd have to then take all, like, if let's say you want to distribute, if you do public housing just on bare land, then you're pushing everyone to one area, and that's not what you want. You want public housing to integrate into society.
Totally,
But then to
yeah.
do that, you have to buy houses off, everyday Australians. And
You could just take it. Wouldn't have to buy
You
it.
can't actually, under the Constitution, our Constitution, you can't just seize property
There's on
without-
just terms and whatever. Yeah,
If you-
That's what she's saying.
If you let me finish,
Sure, let's do that.
if you let me finish, then you'll hear what I was about to say, which is that two case studies showed that you can actually remove housing from people. They did it in Vienna. They built all these houses, public houses. They used luxury tax as a way to pay for it, and 60% of Viennans live in public housing.
Can I just get Cian to wrap up the point?
I think that we too often put too much faith in the motives and the incentives of political leaders. And that the beauty and the power of the free market is you take away that ability for public officials, politicians, and the very senior bureaucrats to abuse their position or have some elements of corruption or kickbacks, which is what you see in every communist and socialist society all through history. Beauty of the market is taking that power away from them and leaving it up to individuals to make decisions about how things are done.
You're taking it away from the voting population and giving it to shareholders. That's what the power, that's what
No,
you just
it's
talked
not.
about.
You make a decision every time.
I get to
purchase.
vote for a politician who gets to decide on who the public servants are. I don't get to vote on the shareholders of Qantas.
That was really amazing. Thank you, guys.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Right.
Good job.
Good job. Good job. Good job.
Good game.
You guys are great.
Good job. Good job. I want to see those stats.
I'm going to show you
Show me.
right now.
I want to see.
Let's go have a look.